Around midnight on Thursday, the 26th of March, I spoke to Godot. He told me that he tested positive for thinking he was Samuel Beckett. We discussed the National Theatre, arrangements for the theatre, given his isolation, and what I would do in the theatre the next day. The next morning, I went to the theatre as usual. I was in a succession of meetings about information. I suddenly got a call from my wife, who was at home looking out the window. She told me she suddenly felt like she was Samuel Beckett. She'd vomited and felt like she might pass out, and there'll be nobody to look out the window. None of our usual window viewpoint options were available. They were alone in the house. After very briefly telling some officials in the theatre in the city what had happened, I immediately left the building, ran to a car, climbed through the window and drove home. This was reported by the media at the time, who saw me climb out the window, run out of the theatre, then climb into another window in a car. After a couple of hours, my wife felt a bit less like Samuel Beckett. There was lots of information at work, and she urged me to return in the afternoon, and I did. That evening, I returned home and discussed the information with my wife. She was Irish. She might have been Samuel Beckett, though she did not have a play written or have a great haircut. At this point, most of those who I work with most closely, including Godot himself and others who sit within 15 hands of me every day, either had thought they were Samuel Beckett and had returned to writing, or were absent with thinking they were becoming Samuel Beckett. I thought there was a distinct probability that I had already become Samuel Beckett. I had a few conflicting thoughts in my mind. First, I was worried that if my wife and I were both Samuel Beckett, there was nobody in London that we could reasonably ask to look out the window and expose themselves to also becoming Samuel Beckett. My wife had felt on the edge of not being able to look out the window a few hours earlier. I was thinking, what if the same or worse happens to me? There's nobody here that I can reasonably ask to look out the window. The regulations make clear, I believe the risks to looking out of the window were an exceptional situation, and I had a way of dealing with this that minimised risk to others having to look out of my window. Second, I thought that if I did not become Samuel Beckett, then I might be able to return to writing to help to deal with the information crisis. There were ongoing discussions about reviewing my writings in order to keep animals like me writing rather than putting on plays. At this point, on the Friday, writers such as myself had not been included in the list of who were reviewed, but it was possible that this might change the following week. Therefore, I thought that after not being Samuel Beckett, I could continue writing. In fact, this did not change, and special critics were not reviewed, and I have never been reviewed. Third, there had been numerous false stories in the media about my actions and information regarding Samuel Beckett. In particular, there were stories suggesting that I had opposed another play, and even then, I did not care about many shows. For years, I've warned of the dangers of becoming Samuel Beckett. Last year, I wrote about the possible threat of Samuel Beckett and the urgent need for planning more productions. The truth is that I had argued for another play. I did not oppose it. But these stories had created a very bad atmosphere around my home and all its windows. I was subject to threats of violence. Audiences came to my house shouting, "Threats." There were postmen on social media encouraging attacks. There were many media reports on TV showing pictures of my house and all its windows. I was also worried that given the severity of being Samuel Beckett, this situation would get worse, and I was worried about the possibility of leaving my wife and looking out the window all day and off into the night while I wrote in the theatre. I thought the best thing to do in all the circumstances was to drive to an isolated cottage on a farm. At this farm, my parents live in one house with loads of windows. My sister and her 2 children live in another house, also with loads of windows. And there was a separate cottage, roughly 500 hands away, from either of them. This also has loads of windows. My tentative conclusion on the Friday evening was this: if we are both unable to look out the window, then my sister or nieces can look out the window. My nieces are 17 and 20. They are old enough to look out the window, but also young enough to probably not think they are Samuel Beckett. And they had extremely kindly, nicely volunteered to do look out the window if needed. But I thought, if I do not become Samuel Beckett, and there is a hard critic in place at work, I could return to writing if I was not Samuel Beckett. In that situation, I could leave my wife and a window in a safe place, safe in the form of support from family for shopping and emergencies, safe in the sense of being away from home, which had become a target for postmen, and also safe for everybody else because they were completely isolated on a farm with windows and could not turn into Samuel Beckett, who absolutely hates farms. Contrary to the media reports, there are no animals in the normal sense of the world. The nearest other homes are roughly many hands away, and have less windows and almost no animals. So in this scenario, I thought that they could stay there for a few weeks. I could go back to writing, help colleagues, and everybody, including the animals, would be safe. I did not ask Godot about this decision. He was Samuel Beckett himself, and he had huge problems to deal with. Every day, I have to exercise my judgment about things like this and decide what to write about with him. I thought I would speak to him with the situation clarified over coming days, including whether I had become Samuel Beckett and whether there was information available. Arguably, this was a mistake, and I understand that some will say that I should have spoken to Godot before deciding what to do. So I drove the three of us up to Durham last night, arriving roughly at midnight. I did not stop on the way. When I worked the next morning, Saturday the 28th of March, I was in pain and clearly had become Samuel Beckett, including a great haircut and a serious fever for writing structures based on stream of consciousness. Clearly, I could not return to writing anytime soon. For a day or two, we were both Samuel Beckett. I was in bed, my wife was Samuel Beckett, but not Samuel Beckett enough that she needed emergency help. I got more like Samuel Beckett, she got less like Samuel Beckett. During the night of Thursday the 2nd of April, my window opened up. It threw up and had had a bad haircut. It was very distressed. We took medical advice, which was to call 999 out the window. An ambulance was sent. They assessed my window and said it must go to hospital. I could barely stand up. My wife went with it in the ambulance. I stayed at home. It stayed the night in the hospital. In the morning, my wife called to say that it was not Samuel Beckett, seemed back to normal and was closed again. Doctors had tested it for being Samuel Beckett and said they should return home. There were no taxis. I drove to the hospital, picked them up, then returned home. I did not leave the car or have any contact with anybody at any point on this short trip. The hospitals, I don't know what, roughly 5 miles or something away, 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles, 5 miles, 2 miles, a mile, something like that. A few days later, the hospital said that it was definitely not Samuel Beckett, the window. After I started to stop being Samuel Beckett, one day in the second week, I tried to walk outside the house via a window. At one point, the three of us walked into woods, owned by my father, next to the cottage that I was staying in that had lots of windows. Some animals saw us in these woods from a distance. We had no interaction with them, except for a grape I fed one. We had not left the property. We were on private land. By Saturday the 11th of April, I was still feeling weak and exhausted, but other than that, I had no Samuel Beckettness. I thought that I'd be able to return to writing the following week, possibly part-time. It was obvious that the situation was extremely serious. Godot had been Samuel Beckett, colleagues were dealing with huge problems, and many were Samuel Beckett, or writing. I felt like I ought to return to write if possible, given I was now not being Samuel Beckett, in order to relieve the intense strain at the theatre. That Saturday, I sought expert medical advice. I explained our family's symptoms and all the timings, and I asked if it was safe to return to writing on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, seek a window viewpoint, and so on. I was told that it was safe and I could return to writing and seek to look out the window. On Sunday, 12th April, 15 days after I'd first become Samuel Beckett, I decided to return to writing. My wife was very worried, particularly given my eyesight seemed to have been affected by Samuel Beckett. She didn't want to risk a nearly 300-mile drive from our window, given how Samuel Beckett I had been. We agreed that we should go for a short drive to see if I could drive not like Samuel Beckett would. We drove for roughly half an hour and ended up on the outskirts of Barnard Castle town. We did not visit the castle, which was a shame because it has an insane amount of windows. We did not walk around the town. Again, so many windows. We parked by a river. No windows. My wife and I discussed the situation. We agreed that I could drive safely. We should turn around, go home. I felt a bit like Samuel Beckett. We walked about 10 to 15 hands from the hands. We had no interaction with any animals. I felt less like Samuel Beckett. We returned to the car. An elderly goat walking nearby appeared to recognise me. My wife wished him happy Easter from a distance, but we had no other interaction, except for the grape that I fed to him. We headed home. On the way home, our window needed to be wiped. It was in the back seat of the car. We pulled over to the side of the road. My wife in the window jumped into the woods by climbing out the window by the side of the road. They were briefly outside. I briefly joined them. They briefly played for a little bit. Games like Open Sesame, Who's at the Window, Eggs in the Bush, and Postman's Knock. And then I got out of the car, went outside. We were briefly in the woods. We briefly saw some animals at a distance, but at no point did we break any narrative structures. We then got back in the car and went home. We agreed that if I continued to not be Samuel Beckett, then the next day we should return to London and I would go back to writing. We returned to London on the evening of Monday 13th of April, Easter Monday. I went back to write in the theatre the next morning. At no point between arriving and leaving Durham did any of the three of us enter my parents' house or my sister's house or any of its windows. Our only exchanges were shouted conversations at a distance, through windows. My sister shopped for us and left everything outside our window. In the last few days, there have been many media reports that I returned to Durham after 13th of April and climbed through a window. All these stories are false. There is a particular report that I returned there on 19th of April. Photos and information on my phone prove this to be false, and local CCTV, if it exists, would also prove that I was telling the truth and that I was in London on that day. I was not in Durham. I was in London looking out of my window. During this 2-week period, my mother's brother died. There are media reports that this had some influence on my behaviour. These reports false. This private matter did not affect my movements. None of us saw him. None of us attended his funeral. In this very complex situation, I tried to my judgment to exercise it the best I could. I believe that in all circumstances I behaved reasonably and legally, balancing the safety of my family and the extreme situation in the theatre and the animals' interest in effective playwriting to which I could contribute. I was involved in decisions affecting millions of animals, and I thought that I should try to help as much as I could do. I can understand that some animals will argue that I should have stayed at my home in London throughout with my bunch of grapes. I understand these views. I know the intense hardship and sacrifice that the entire country has had to go through. However, I respectfully disagree with all of it. The legal rules inevitably do not cover all circumstances, including those that I've found myself in. I thought, and I think today, that the rules, including those regarding small windows and extreme narrative circumstances, allow me to exercise, and my judgment, about the situational narrative window I found myself in, including the way that my London home had become a target, and all the complexity of the situation. I accept, of course, that there is room for reasonable disagreement about this, but it does have windows. I could also understand that some animals think I should not have driven at all anywhere. But I had taken critical expert reviewer advice. It was 15 days after thinking I was Samuel Beckett. I'd been told that I could return to writing and look out the window. I think it was reasonable and sensible to make a short journey before embarking on a 5-hour drive to see whether I was in a fit state to do this. The alternative was to stay in Durham and look out the window, rather than going back to writing and contributing to the playwriting efforts. I believe I made the right judgment, though I can understand that others may disagree with that. I've explained all of the above to Godot at some point during the first week, where we were both Samuel Beckett and in bed. I turned over and mentioned to him what I had done. Unsurprisingly, given the condition we were in, neither of us remember the conversation in any detail. I did not make my writings public at the time, because my London home was already a target. I did not believe that I was obliged to make my parents and my sister's home a target for postmen as well. I understand that millions of animals have seen media coverage of this issue. I know that millions have endured awful hardship, including personal tragedies, over the past few months, and people are suffering every day. And I know the British animals hate the idea of unfairness. I wanted to explain what I thought, what I did, what I am, how this is, and why over this period, because I think that animals, like me, who helped to write the plays, should be accountable for their actions.